For some analysis of Brazil's election results, we can speak to today's perspective guest, Marieke Riethof, a senior lecturer in Latin American politics at Liverpool University. Thank you so much for joining us. Can you just start by giving us your reaction to these results? Are you surprised by how close this race turned out to be?
I expected it to be close based on the first round elections. Because Bolsonaro's vote was much stronger than expected in the polls in the first round. So my worry was that his vote would pick up in the second round, but it didn't quite do that. It was closer than I would have expected from the polls, but a narrow win for Lula, certainly.
And we haven't heard from Jair Bolsonaro yet. Are you concerned that he might not accept these results?
It's quite possible that he won't respect the results, because he has been calling for months to question the electoral process, and to say to his supporters that if he loses the election, it's probably stolen, or he will be killed or put in prison. So he has been mobilizing his supporters to, on the one hand, to question the democratic process, and it's still to be seen how he will react now. What is interesting is that some of his supporters have publicly declared last night that the election results should be respected. So that's important. It means that he is losing some of his allies for a potential non-democratic solution.
So you think if Bolsonaro does try to contest these results, he might not necessarily get any support behind him?
Yes. He also, another question is whether the armed forces are potentially willing to back him in a rally against Lula. That is less predictable. I think there are pockets of the military who support Lula, but there are other groups who respect constitutional and democratic control over the armed forces.
And Bolsonaro may have lost the presidency, but his party and right-wing allies have won majorities in both chambers of Congress. Does that make this election somewhat of a victory for him?
It will. For Lula, this causes a lot of problems in how his presidency will work. Forming majorities is always a challenge in Brazil with so many parties, but now he faces a very polarized Senate and lower house, which could also paralyze some of his policy initiatives. And it's clear that Bolsonaro has a lot of electoral support in Parliament, but also that he has a lot of support from voters still, which indicates a very polarized situation.
Yeah, and how do you see Lula going about governing such a polarized society? What's his strategy going to be?
So in his victory speech last night, Lula immediately appealed to God, so citing religion, which is very important for some of the Bolsonaro supporters. He also appealed to all Brazilians to respect democracy and to see this as a victory of democracy. So he has taken an approach of reconciliation, calling for peace. I think that's a smart strategy, not to demonize Bolsonaro supporters, but still many of them are quite unhappy about the result. In government, the Lula's vice president, Jair, is a center-right, a very established politician who will help with the forming of a majority coalition. And Lula will probably have to make some concessions in practice in government, but that is not unusual, of course, in a coalition and majoritarian political situation like in Brazil.
And we tend to talk about a North-South divide in Brazil, with Lula getting more support in the North, which is poorer, and with Bolsonaro having more support in the wealthier South. But where do you see the fault lines in Brazilian society?
The most important state in this elections was Minas Gerais, so center east, and it's a state that has always picked the winner in the presidential elections, and Lula won it narrowly, but lost the PT lost it in 2018. Another key observation is that Lula strengthened his vote in the Northeast, where some of the poorest Brazilians live, while Bolsonaro is very strong in state agriculture, where the Amazonian frontier is shifting, so deforestation is happening. Lula's vote is strong in several cities in the southeast, like Sao Paulo, which he won decisively over the national percentage. So this indicates that the Lula's result and the Workers' Party's result is much stronger in that sense than in 2018, although it leaves open accusations that he is going to be primarily a president for the Northeast and poor Brazilians, which is, of course, also a good thing.
And Lula has made one of the most amazing political comebacks in history. How do you think he's seen by voters outside of his strongest supporters? Is there still a shadow of corruption that hangs over him?
It's hard to imagine that only 2 years ago he was in prison, and it seemed unlikely that he would ever be running again for the presidency. Of course, his convictions have been lifted, and he was released from prison. But there are many Bolsonaro supporters, in particular, who believe that he is still guilty of corruption. I think it's fairly safe to say that he has been thoroughly investigated, Lula, for corruption charges. So there is probably much less of a likelihood of that happening again. But it is a concern that people on the Bolsonaro supporting side would still see Lula as a criminal, as they did in the run-up of the 2018 elections, and that was a very powerful message at the time.
And we are running out of time, but I do just want to ask you quickly what we can expect from Lula on a regional and an international level.
Lula has always been very strong in terms of coalitions of other Latin American countries and developing countries. So I expect him to work on that. And with many left and center-left governments in power, that kind of coalition looks very likely to be stronger than over the last 4 years.
All right, Marieke Riethof, a senior lecturer in Latin American politics at Liverpool University. Thank you so much for your analysis this morning on Brazil's election results.